David Williams started out in a small school in Alabama and ventured into working for companies like Northrop, Boeing, and supported the Apollo program. Here is David's story. Hey everybody, do I have a treat for you today? On the phone with me, I have David Williams, and he's going to share with us his story about his math and science background and how it benefited and helped his life and others. So one of the first questions, David, is who are you and where did you grow up?
My name is David Williams, and I was born in February 10, 1938 in Luverne, Alabama, which is a small town about 50 miles south of Montgomery on Highway 331.
How big was the school that you went to?
Back in those days, in our part of the country, high school consisted of grades 7 through 12. Among those grades, we had probably between 400 or 500 students in all. My graduating class, we had 70.
What math and science classes did you take in high school?
Well, there was plane geometry. We probably had solid geometry. I couldn't swear to that in court. There was, arithmetic. It seems like we did this in the 7th grade. The highest math that we had was algebra in general. There was extra class offered to seniors in trigonometry. In the small school there, one of my teachers was mother's best friend. She taught me English. My mother taught me junior high science. My girlfriend's mother taught me physics and chemistry. My best friend's aunt taught me typewriting. And so we were surrounded basically by teachers who we knew personally.
What was life like studying in college?
We started out at Vanderbilt back in those days in what was called college algebra in the first quarter. We won the quarter system that first year. We switched to semesters the next year, but I had to sometimes study 5 hours a day to do the college algebra homework. I had to work really hard that first quarter where these guys from New York City could come in and get that same homework in 15 minutes. By the end of that quarter, though, I was up with them. And I had something they didn't have. I had developed good study habits, and they'd been able to get by like I had gotten by in high school. They did in college what I had done in high school. But anyway, I learned that I really had a penchant for math. And when I got to Vanderbilt, I knew as much physics and chemistry as anybody, which is interesting coming from a town of 2,500 people. You got students from all over the country coming to Vanderbilt. So the message there is you can find a good teacher anywhere.
Okay.
And it's so important. The teacher makes all the difference.
I was going to ask you, too, some of the rigorous study habits that you developed in Vanderbilt, what did you do differently?
I just spent more time. I actually studied the material and studied the textbooks. That's another thing that I think is important. It's important to have good textbooks. I never took notes. Taking notes is a problem. If you're taking notes, you can't take notes and listen carefully at the same time. I mean, maybe there are people that can. To me, the best classroom environment is one where when that teacher is talking or drawing on the board or whatever, you're focused completely on what that teacher is saying and showing you and trying to get it in as good as you can. Then, when you get home and you do your homework, what she was talking about should be either in a textbook or in a handout she's giving you. And that's when you really start, that's how you study. But if you take notes and then go study your notes, you're getting an inferior result, in my opinion.
So how did you get into Vanderbilt?
The Palmer Scholarship, which was started by an endowment, a fellow that had graduated from Vanderbilt, and he had set up a scholarship fund. It was administered by a board, and every year they would interview students from our county and all the counties in Alabama that touched Baldwin County. You had to be from one of those counties. and they would interview prospective students. And I had a pretty good average in high school. I was probably, in the top 10% of the class. And so Mother got me an interview with the scholarship committee. They could send you to one of three schools. They could send you to the University of Alabama, to Auburn, or to Vanderbilt. And that was the provision in Mr. Palmer's original endowment for the scholarship fund.
When you were in high school and when you were in college, were you trying to study to get good grades, or were you trying to understand the material?
In high school, I think that I was trying to not be looked down upon by my teachers and being surrounded by my mother and my mother's best friend and my best friend's aunt and my girlfriend's mother and so forth. I think really when I look around it, I wanted people to like me. And I was interested in the subject matter that I was interested in, that was intriguing to me. I did want to learn the subject matter. I wasn't really concentrating on, I need to get an A and B, but always in the back of your mind, or my mind, was the idea, well, if I didn't, if I came out with a bunch of B's and C's and that's all I got, and it was considered mediocre, what was my mother going to think and my mother's best friend going to think and all that?
So it was a combination.
When I got to college, I just wanted to make good. That included both things. It included not only learning and understanding the subject, but the grades were important too, of course, because if you, in the unlikely event that you really understood a subject but had a bad grade, you might not get a job that you deserve to get. So they sort of went together, right? If you understand the subject real good, you're likely to get a good grade. So, but my motivation into college was I knew when I came out of there, I was going to have to probably spend the rest of my life working in a field that I had chosen. And so I was motivated to learn the material. One important thing here, too, that is when you're learning material, you don't want to do a lot of memorizing. Well, there are subjects where that's about all there is, but when you're talking about math, and in particular math or physics, which is closely related, you want to try to get a sort of an understanding, a comprehension of the fundamentals and how the different factors relate to each other, so that later on in life you can use these fundamentals in developing new approaches and new theories that nobody has done before. So you don't want to just try to memorize things.
Let's move on to your jobs that you had since leaving college. Once you take that chronologically, you had some pretty interesting jobs since school.
I mentioned when I first graduated from Vanderbilt, I'd been in ROTC, so I got commissioned as second lieutenant in the Army Reserve. But I delayed, went to graduate school for a year at the University of Alabama. Then the very first job I had was the summer after graduate school at the University of Alabama. I had a job with Boeing in Seattle. That was an interesting job. I went into a group of people that were doing flight mechanics that were simulating the motion of orbiting spacecraft in proximity to each other about the Earth, and they had begun development of an analog simulation. Today, all of the computers are digital, but back in that day, simulations of this nature were done on analog computers. Boeing had actually invented, in a way, or actually developed and created probably maybe the first large-scale industrial-size analog computer, which consisted of a lot of these 6-foot-tall metal cabinets with a lot of places to plug in wires and adjust knobs and things of this nature. And by making electrical voltages and currents behave as you wanted to, you could actually simulate physical things where a voltage would represent something like the speed of a spacecraft. And you could monitor that voltage and see what the time history of the speed and so forth. So we modeled the flight mechanics of two orbiting spacecraft where one could maneuver and try to dock with the other one. After that 3-month summer job, I was in the guided missile department of the U.S. Army's Artillery and Missile School there. They've changed the name now. There is no U.S. Army Artillery and Missile School per se at Fort Sill now, but they still, I'm sure, do the same kind of stuff. But this school trained officers and enlisted men in how to operate and maintain the missile systems and rocket systems that the Army was in charge of at that time. I was in a branch that was led by a captain, and there were 4 of us second lieutenants. But at Vanderbilt, I had graduated early, about a week. We had our graduation exercise about a week before these other guys had graduated from their colleges. I'd been commissioned then, so I was a senior second lieutenant because I had seniority. I'd gotten my commission about a week earlier. And so I was in charge of that whole group, and it consisted of Army technical sergeants and some warrant officers and some civilian contractors and these other lieutenants. And our job was to teach classes, which included officers and enlisted men, how to operate and maintain the ground support equipment for the old Corporal missile system. It was called the WAC Corporal missile system. It was old at that time and was soon to be phased out, but that was what our branch did. I did that for a while, and then we had this duty roster for the whole guided missile department. And it would not, if you were on it, at some point it would become your time to be the security officer, which meant that at the end of that day, you would go around the entire department, and it's a pretty big department, checking all the safes to make sure they were all locked and all the classified material was secured. Well, I did that night. And then the next morning when I came in, the warrant officer that was at the door of the building, he said, "Lieutenant Williams," he said, "the colonel wants to see you, Colonel Dessesseur." And he was the head of the guided missile department. And boy, I almost did I didn't pass out, but I got a little anxious because I'd been the security officer the night before, and I was sure that it related to that. But what it really was we had this Cuban Missile Crisis, where we had found out Russia was deploying these missiles into Cuba. So I went in to see the colonel, and he said, "Lieutenant Williams," he said, "at 3:00 this afternoon, you will be catching a plane to Fort Benning, Georgia, where you're going to be a forward observer. The expected lifetime of a forward observer is in the number of minutes." So it's not a very good job to have if you have a worthy opponent. I got there, and I went in such a hurry, I left my glasses. But I could do 90% of stuff you need to do without wearing them, and I just didn't like to wear them, and I left them. So there I was at Fort Benning, a forward observer without my glasses. Now, I had binoculars, but of course they don't correct for astigmatism. So there we were, ready to go into Cuba. And we were ready to go. We were actually given briefings of where we were going to hit the beach and everything. And we were given instructions like, when you get to a sugarcane field, try to go through it, and don't go around it, burn it down. Things like that. And so, boy, we were all hyped up to go. And then Russia's Premier Khrushchev, he backed down, and we didn't have to go. And years later, I was really happy for that. After that, I was there maybe 4 months at Fort Benning. I came back to Fort Sill. Then I went into the operations staff for the department and was just sort of on staff there. And one of the jobs that came my way, the job of managing the Army's amateur rocket program. It was really a small program. They only had a few participants every year. But the Army would provide a place where amateurs from anywhere across the nation could bring their little rockets that they'd built and set them up and launch them, and we supported that.
Okay, so you went from the Army to Boeing, is that correct? And how did that happen?
That's right, yeah. When I got out of the Army, the Congress had passed a law that if you wanted to get out and go back to school, you could get out 3 months early. So my normal tour would have been 2 years, but I got out 3 months early. And before going to work for Boeing, I went back to graduate school at the University of Alabama and spent those 3 months working on a thesis, was halfway through it, I thought I developed some unique equations for orbital motion, and I was pretty happy about that. And about halfway through my research, I found out there were a couple of guys that 12 years earlier had developed those very same equations, and not only that, those equations had their names attached to it. So that sort of took the air out of my balloon because it was too late now to try to do another thesis thing, so I had to leave that where it was, and I went to work for Boeing here in Huntsville. In the aerospace world at that time, the companies really liked electrical engineers because we had more math than mechanical engineers or chemical engineers or civil engineers. We had more mathematics, and that's what they needed. I started with Boeing. Of course, I'd been with them back in Seattle a couple of years earlier for 3 months. And the 2 years that I was gone, they gave me credit for those as far as seniority went. So I was back with the company that I'd started with briefly 2 years earlier. Boeing had several thousand engineers in this one great big multi-story building. What was interesting is almost all of them were in what you would call the Apollo program, which everyone's familiar with, the program that eventually we put men on the moon.
Another thing that I found that I wanted for you to talk about, the fiber optic guided missile. That's pretty awesome. Can you go over that?
In Huntsville here, out on Redstone Arsenal, the Army has a research and development group that develops the prototypes, creates, prototypes for these kinds of things. They have these ideas, and of course there are a lot of civilian contractor companies that support these people. And at the time I was involved in this fiber optically guided missile thing, I was working for Computer Sciences Corporation. Right around 1980, in the early 80s, the Army developed this missile, which when it was launched and flew, it trailed out thin optical fiber behind it. You communicated with this missile through the optical fiber, and you could give it guidance commands and everything. And in the nose of the missile was a sensor. The early versions of it, they would put something like a television type camera sensor, a Vidicon cube, and then in later versions they would put they were going to use infrared, a sensor that was sensitive to infrared radiation. And so basically you could see a picture as this missile flew. It was looking ahead, and you could see the ground and the horizon and see the objects. All of this information traveled back on the optical fiber. And then back at the other end of the optical fiber was what they called a gunner station. It was sort of like a thing about as big as an outhouse where you sat in there and you had this television monitor, and you were basically seeing what the missile was seeing, and then you had a joystick, and you would command the missile to go right, left, up, and down, and guide it. And basically this was to be an anti-tank missile. And so you see a tank, and you guide over toward it, and you dive on the tank. And then when the missile hits the tank, of course, the warhead explodes and supposedly disables or destroys the tank. So one of the most important elements in this kind of development work, and most any kind of development work, is what is called modeling and simulation. You look at what's actually happening in the physical world, and you develop a mathematical model of it so that you can predict exactly what the nature of the engagement's going to be from start to finish. Sometimes you can do it all on a digital computer. Sometimes your simulation involves lots of hardware that may not be the actual missile hardware, but other types of hardware like movie projectors and video cameras and servo motors and things like that. Our company got the contract to develop a simulator for this fiber optically guided missile. And then later at Boeing, in a lunar rover project, we had a mini computer. It was about 3 feet high and about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide. And we had
That's a mini computer?
yeah, that was a mini computer back then. And it was an IBM developed mini, I don't know if they called it computer or not, but that's what it was. And we're looking at a screen, And we had light pins. On this screen up at the top was a whole line of symbols. And we could take that light pin and touch it, and then come down on the screen and touch a point, and that symbol would appear there. We could go up and get another symbol and touch a point and so forth, and we could actually create a schematic on the screen of the CRT that was like the analog simulation I was talking to you about, what we did at Luverne. It was a digital representation of an analog simulation right on the monitor screen.
Wow.
And it was connected to that digital computer, that mini computer. We could simulate the motion of the lunar rover rolling around on the lunar surface. And the second company I worked for in Huntsville was Northrop, and we had some interesting support contracts with them. Some of them were general in nature, and we'd have several different customer contacts for different problems that the company, the Northrop, would be helping them with at all times. And we were able to develop some new and unique methods for determining quasi-optimum trajectories for various missions, and rockets and so forth. Trajectory optimization was a very interesting and popular subject for years and years. You know where you are, and you know where you want to go, and what's the very best path to take to get there to achieve some performance objective, which the performance objective could be different things. And so the mathematics involved with that and the logic and the techniques were all very interesting. So that was quite a rewarding part of my career. And after Northrop was Computer Sciences Corporation, where we developed that FogM simulator and did other things. And then the last company I worked for was a local company, started in the 70s here by a couple of guys. By the time I went with them in 1986, they had grown into a company of about 700 or 800 people. Dynetics, they would add 10% to your salary and put it into the investment plan. And so that was one significant reason that I left computer sciences to go to Dynetics. And I stayed with them for a little over 20 years, and that was the last company I worked for, retiring in 2007 from Dynetics. Almost all the work that we did at Dynetics was classified work. Not long after I got there, I had top secret clearance, which I kept on even after retirement.
Do you have any words of encouragement or tips for success for the students at Gaucher High School?
It never hurts to take your studying seriously. Take it seriously. Some things are hard to learn later, and you need to learn them when you're young. The thing to do is pay attention in class. Listen to the teacher. Now, people have different philosophies maybe on taking notes. I mentioned earlier that I didn't take notes. I thought it more important to try to absorb everything the teacher was telling me or showing me. I didn't want to be distracted with notes. Now, I know that may not be a popular version. Note-taking is, from time immemorial, has been done, and maybe most people can be listening while they're taking notes and absorbing while they're taking notes, but I think it's tough to do.
You had mentioned persevering through those times when you're banging your head against the wall trying to solve something. Can you talk about that?
I'm glad you brought that up. And the reason I thought about that was the time that I was at Northrop. I'd go in my office and I would shut the door. So I'm the only one in there. It's pretty quiet. And I'm working on a real tough problem. And the mind is just focused, struggling. Like, man, maybe days go by. I'm just not going to be able to figure this out. And you don't give up. You just keep on. And then it's like, all of a sudden, oh yeah, I can do it this way. lots of times, I guess, I would realize at that point that, I had some help. That wasn't all coming from me. God says, that guy's really trying hard. I think I'm going to let him figure it out.
Is there any other final advice you'd like to pass on?
Try to develop an affection for your teachers. Respect that teacher, whether you think the teacher deserves it or not. That's one thing you can do. You can do that. Respect the teacher. Help the teacher if you can. Learn everything the teacher's got to tell you, because it's important, and you'll be so glad you did.
What an amazing life story David Williams has. David Williams' life is an example of what is possible if you persist diligently in pursuing math and science.